VALIS!
We're in!
Oh, what's that smell?
I don't know. Let me put this hat lamp on. Let me put this hat lamp on. It's much better.
Crumbly Cosby. Where do you
Crumbly
think they keep
Cosby. Where do you think they keep
the ears?
the
Wine
ears?
gums?
Wine gums.
Harambago?
Harambago.
Woodbines.
Woodbines. The bones.
Here it is, the VALIS Podcast.
The VALIS
intro.
Podcast intro.
It's time for the
Blowing
Dolly Hall
the
Chimp
dust off.
Testing Facility
It's time for the
takeover.
Nolly Hall Chimp
Run
Testing
VT.
Facility takeover. What are we going to talk about? On VT.
What we're going to talk about.
Check video title of video. VALIS intro. ...
All right.
Grab this.
Welcome.
This is the VALIS Podcast. This is the VALIS Podcast.
Hi everyone, this is the VALIS Podcast, an irregularly recorded podcast about various art and cultural stuff that we find interesting. As you'll already have noticed, Stuart Dukes, the normal MC of these things, isn't available today. So we've had a Nolly Hall Chimp Testing Facility takeover. Myself, Rigby, and my co-conspirator, Brendan O'Leary, are here to talk about something of interest to us both. So, Brendan, do you want to give us a quick intro to yourself?
Hi, Phil.
Hi.
I, in my artistic realms, make the rock and roll music under the name of O'Leary 1599 and other things, such as. Also, in the past, was in a piss poor indie band with you, Phil Rigby, 20 to 25 years ago, called The Fleck. We also write musical theatre together, and last year we wrote a drama based on A Wild Night of James Brown and Nick Nolte called Different Universes, which was successfully performed in Wigan Town, our home, and many, much more. Thank you for inviting me to your VALIS.
Yeah, man. So we are those types that are into musical theatre, and we have a bit of a potted track record of musical projects, including the Dragon Bomb.
Oh yes.
So we had a long conversation about different stuff that we could talk about over this podcast, and we finally fell upon the topic of Mr. Tim Kinsella from Chicago. So I thought we quick first of all just talk a little bit about why we picked on Tim Kinsella, because I've really only been introduced to him quite recently through yourself. Probably about 6 months ago, you sent me a video through of his Issues single, which is really funny. It's a really funny video to watch.
Because he's naked.
He's got his bum out in the video, and he's doing all kinds of dad dancing whilst being starkers. But it's a really good tune. I listened to it quite a few times and shared it with a few people, just as in like, haha, look at this. But the more that I listened to it, the more that I kind of got into it. And that was when you said, well, it's the singer from Joan of Arc. It's the main guy out of them, to which I then started exploring that stuff. But my only knowledge of Joan of Arc up to that point was the fact that it was a band that you were into in the 90s when we were in a band together, and a mutual friend of ours had said, oh, it's emo, and that had kind of put me off right from the start, listening into it. But the last 6 months of wading through his back catalogue have been a real treat. And so when you suggested doing something on Kinsella, I thought it's a really good idea. And there's other reasons as well, but do you want to talk a little bit about why you wanted to talk about Tim Kinsella?
Yeah, because it was one of those bands that when their first album came out, was it Portable Model and I bought it from Alan's Records in Wigan, and I really liked it. I was playing it in my room. My mum was like, "Is this you singing?" He doesn't really sound like me, but there's definitely something there. And I was like, and I blast through records. I don't generally listen to the same record over and over, but I did listen to that record a lot. And it wasn't emo. It was some strange kind of blend of like this post-rock kind of tortoisey kind of stuff with some electronic.
Were you aware of the term emo at the time when you first came across it?
Well, like what emo then became later, like goth stuff and My Chemical Romance, that hadn't happened at that point because this is still like 99 or whatever. So at that point, emo was, I guess, Sunny Day Real Estate and stuff like that was fairly popular, but sounded a lot more like college rock. But I was working in Ireland at the time as well, and they had a lot of what would have been termed that first kind of wave of emo, which was emotional hardcore, which I guess was like Jawbreaker and stuff like that. And so around that time, they also re-released that Cap and Jazz anthology, which was Kinsella's band before Joan of Arc, and both of those records I just listened to him a lot, and they really appealed to me. There was something about his lyricism, and especially that Joan of Arc album, this kind of mix of that Chicago post-rock with these quite abrasive lyrics and singing. Because a lot of the other stuff, if you listen to like Gastro del Sol and the David Grubb stuff and all the Tortoise stuff, it was kind of laid back. The Sam Prekop stuff, it was soft and it was kind of cool, but this also had that kind of edge to it. But having now gone back and listened in the last few like months to like bands that came after or around the same time, like The Promise Ring, which was the other guy from Cap and Jazz, to me at the time they were so different. These two bands were so far apart. I hated The Promise Ring and Jets to Brazil and all of that kind of second wave emo that was essentially like college rock. And but then going back and listening, it's not that different. but there are some key differences that we'll talk about, like especially Victor Villarreal's guitar and Kinsella's lyrics and vocals. And I think there's enough of a difference that I'll still go back and listen to those early Joan of Arc albums, but I will never listen to a Promise Ring LP.
So there's a couple of things just for people listening who won't have a clue what we're talking about. Alan's is quite an important record shop in the town where we grew up, isn't it?
Yeah.
I would say, having been someone who just went in there and didn't actually work in there like you did, it was for people into music, it was a music shop, and for people who weren't into music, I think they saw it as a skating and BMX type shop. It was on sort of scene, wasn't it? And it brought those things together. And
a place for wankers.
It was that as well. So there's that. So there's something about his lyrics and his choice of words as opposed to the other stuff that was around at the same time. And there's something about how he delivers those words as well, isn't there? And I think
absolutely
quite right in Cap and Jazz, which is a band that I'm not as familiar with as I am with Joan of Arc now. But there's some amazing musicality in the band as well, because it's not just on first listen. You could be forgiven for thinking they are just another punk band, I think, at the time. But there is something quite majestic about some of the guitar pieces that are put in it. Victor Villarreal's sort of classically inspired stuff and arpeggios is a bit different to the other stuff that's going on.
Yeah, and even Kinsella's guitar, and it's hard in those early albums to know who's playing what because it's not always clear, but I think Kinsella's guitar style is similar And we'll talk about it more about that kind of complexity and the quick changes and that arpeggiated kind of style. I guess in the section later when we talk about like composition of songs, but it might be good to just delve a little bit into this fella and who he is. But you're right. You mentioned about us not necessarily liking a lot of the same bands, but there's a few that we do, and I think there's some. If you listen to these bands, that it kind of makes sense why we also like Joan of Arc, because we're both into the Fall, Beefheart, the Beatles, and those are three of the biggest that we generally agreed on from the start. And there's something about all those bands that
there is.
You also get.
I always, when I'm thinking about why I like the Beatles, I always remember a story that my dad told me when I was quite young about somebody he was working with saying, he said, my son's been listening to the Beatles albums, and he goes, I used to like the Beatles when they first started out, and then they went all weird.
Didn't they?
And it's like, but it's when they went all weird, that's when they become more and more interesting. And there's something about that balking at the standard formats for music and what music is supposed to be that is quite interesting, and that's interesting, especially to people who are involved in it, because it's what you can do with it. It's where it's breaking at the seams, isn't it? Where it's kind of straining its own definition.
Yeah, and I think like Mark Smith clearly loves pop music. He clearly loves rock and roll music, and so does Beefheart. You know, but Beefheart basically is trying and failing to be a broken version of Howlin' Wolf, and you know the Beatles are a broken rock and roll band. But then you get someone like the Residents who just failed to. It doesn't seem like they loved the music they were parodying, and it is too, let's say, discordant for mine. It didn't hit that sweet spot. Whereas I think all those bands, including the Kinsella stuff, hits that sweet spot of there's a pure love of this pop music and this rock music, but it's also a desire to like push it to and beyond breaking point at times. Yeah,
and it's interesting because I think with a band like the Beatles or a band like the Fall, it's like they know how the game works and they make a conscious effort to push it in a certain direction.
Yeah.
Whereas I always remember a review of the Monks' Black Monk Time album that says that it describes them as a band incapable of writing a normal pop record. And there's an appeal to that as well, where there's like this desperate authenticity to try and write good pop music, but in failing to do that, create something quite different. The tension between those two sort of camps, isn't it?
And so this fella, Tim Kinsella, he's actually about the same age as us. I think he's born same year as me.
Yeah.
74, so he's mid-40s now. He's been around a bit, but the cap and jazz stuff started when he was young, 14, 15, and they put stuff out on small Chicago labels that were then collected into this kind of like anthology that was in about 94, 95 or whatever, and then by the end of the 90s that anthology was kind of what made them.
So what year does the anthology come out then, just to set some context?
Let me just check. I can't remember. I've got a feeling it's similar to the time the first couple of Joan of Arc albums come out. Yes, so it came out in 98, sorry. So 98 for the anthology, which collected together all of this cap and jazz stuff from 93 to 95. So like, in my mind, this was like old stuff, but it was only actually recorded about 3 years before it kind of came out. And the Joan of Arc stuff I got when it came out, but that was like Cap and Jazz finished in 95 or whatever, and Joan of Arc started in 97. And that's kind of like they were very young. You know, his brother was in Cap and Jazz as well, who's Mike Kinsella, who then became way more famous for his band American Football, which is emo. I'm not a fan of that. But
well, should we quickly just whiz through the different projects that he's set up, just so there's a context for the rest of the discussion. So we've got this early band, which gets called emotional hardcore or emo.
Or Midwest emo was the term there. But it's interesting because it was the emo stuff, but it seemed to have an element of math rock in there,
which is another term that we'll probably be coming back to. Because
post rock, math rock, emo.
Yeah, and because I think there's a historical starting point about 1985, isn't there, with that Rites of Spring album. Just to finish going through his we've got Captain Jazz, which starts in the sort of early to mid-90s.
Yeah.
Joan of Arc, that then comes after it.
Joan of Arc, about 97, 98-ish.
You've got the Sky Cover. Is that just like a one-off project, though? Is that like a one album?
That must have happened after Captain Jazz and before Joan of Arc, and he was, I think, the guy from Mineral or one of the other kind of fairly big Midwest emo bands was in on that, and it doesn't sound too dissimilar to some of the mid-period Joan of Arc stuff. But yeah, so that was the kind of a one-off in around 97, and then I guess Joan of Arc more or less broke up after their third or fourth album. And then the Cap and Jazz guys reformed as Owls in 2001. Mm-hmm. And again, I thought these were years apart, but looking back here, there's basically about 6 years between those three bands.
Yeah.
And then he did a short-lived thing called Friend Enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Again, with a couple of the Joan of Arc guys.
And how would you describe that? Because we're not going to cover that too much, are we? So...
Again, I think the when we get talking about the cleanliness of those first two Joan of Arc albums, once you moved away from those really, really clean guitar sounds and those kind of like almost ambient electronics, you kind of move into the mid-period kind of stuff where there's not as... It's slightly more rocky, it's slightly more indie. Mm-hmm. And I think I'd say Friend Enemy and later when we get to Make Believe, which was a similar time, they're similar to a mid-period Joan of Arc, where I don't think the guitar lines are as clean or and as strong. They've got a slightly more rocky feel, but they've still got that math rock kind of element to them. Yeah,
because my understanding is that Make Believe was them getting back to a slightly more energetic style of playing after a stint on the road.
Yeah, I think it was more rock, and it is a slightly more keyboard-driven sound, but that same kind of like angular and like kind of disjointed and flitting kind of guitar line that basically goes through everything Kinsella does.
Yeah,
more or less is still there pretty prominently.
Which segues us into kind of his solo stuff, I guess. So,
yeah, again, around he danced his didn't, he sang his didn't, he danced his did, which was a similar, I think it was about 2003, 2004. And I think Joan of Arc must have been quite fluid at the time, but then they come back pretty strong and they do the Joan of Arc and Dick Cheney album in 2004. And then for a few years, the Joan of Arc and Make Believe are kind of releasing albums once every year or two. And then something happens around 2007. The Joan of Arc band kind of gets tight again, and they do Boo Human and Flowers and Lifelike, and they're pretty straightforward indie rock records. Yeah. So basically, there's only a few big projects. I think Cap and Jazz then becomes Joan of Arc, and then and Owls is around that time too, which is the guys from Cap and Jazz. And then he does the Make Believe with 3 albums or so. That's more or less it. And out of the 30 or 40 or so albums, way over 50% are under the Joan of Arc banner.
Yeah, it's fair to say that that's his main vehicle, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think he realized that putting Joan of Arc on it probably sold a lot more records. Not wanting to be too cynical about it, but I think it just raised the profile. He actually seems to have taken advantage of that, because in about 2010-ish, he started releasing these Joan of Arc Presents, which are far more improvised kind of pieces. Because we'll talk about this again in a bit, but what defined the earlier stuff was it was really tight and really clean and really kind of this kind of modernist sound. And then sometime around 2010, it does start to get a lot more improvised. And then for 3 or 4 years, he puts out these albums that are under the Joan of Arc Presents kind of heading.
So the starting point is obviously Cap and Jazz. It really reminds me of just quite raggedy indie rock, screamed at a lot of gigs that we were going to in the 90s. It's that kind of, it's a very live sound, isn't it, on the records?
Yeah.
It's very, well, I guess now would be a good time for you to describe Tim Kinsella's vocal style, because I think that really comes across on those early records. It's what a lot of people fell in love with when that anthology came out. But it's quite unique. It's certainly one of the first things that jumps out at you. I had actually had it on the other day in the house when we were getting ready to go out. And a friend who was giving us a lift out walked in on Take On Me, the cover version.
Yeah.
Couldn't quite understand why I was listening to it.
Yeah. There's in the Cap and Jazz stuff, he is kind of screeching. He's got this kind of high-pitched, kind of nasally, kind of screechy, kind of abrasive voice, but it's not guttural, it's not growled. It is kind of like it's sung, but it's screamed, screeched, kind of. And you described it as bellowy. But it's not bellowy in a blowy kind of way. It's bellowy in a like a pterodactyl, screechy kind of bellowy way.
It is the other word that I keep going back to is earnest. Just it seems to be very honest. It's screechy because he really means that shit. It's not screechy because he's trying to deafen everybody in the room.
No, and I think that honesty and that that integrity is something again that runs through all of the music in theory, and when in all of the art and music that he tries to make, he at least tries to show this integrity. And I think when you get to Joan of Arc, there's a change in vocal style, but it's still high-pitched nasally and kind of like it cuts through the sound, but he's not necessarily screaming anymore.
No, it's not, because all of that Cap and Jazz stuff, he adopts that style. It's like, it's a bit of a kind of one-trick pony on those Cap and Jazz albums in terms of his vocal ability to actually sort of to put sound on the record. But what I think is instantly recognisable is this kind of really intense sincerity that he's being honest with. His material, and he's trying to be an artist with it in terms of being sort of transparent.
And I think I bought it, and I don't think I bought the other emo stuff. And it's not to say that those singers were not earnest or were not there wasn't integrity, but there was something about Kinsella's presentation and the early Joan of Arc and Cap and Jazz that just I bought it.
Yeah,
I bought into it, and I'm quite a skeptical and cynical person. So it's like I like the artifice of pop. So I don't think I don't expect Freddie Mercury to mean it when he's singing, "Great King Red died today." It's like that's just a great song, but it's like, but when Kinsella was singing those, it was like there was something else, and it spoke to my.
I noticed you sent me a Pitchfork review, I think, and then the link to the album of a band that was around Algernon Cadwallader, is it?
The Algernon Cadwallader, which was definitely after.
Well, they sound remarkably like Cap and Jazz, and his vocal tone is remarkably similar to Tim Kinsella's in that period. But it's because it ended up getting mixed up in my queue on Spotify and some stuff that I was listening to, and it came on. And at first I was like, "Oh, is this a Cap and Jazz record?" And then when I checked, and it was like, but there is something different in that vocal delivery. Sonically, it sounds very similar, but there is just like a missing element where like you said, I buy it when I hear the Tim Kinsella sort of version of it.
And it's hard to say, and I think that goes back again to Beefheart, Lennon, Mark Smith. It's like, there's not many people that when I hear it, I buy into it. I think I listen to a lot of music and like vocals that I can't believe in or whatever, vocals that don't do that. I can't listen to it. And I think the Algernon and Cadwallader, I sent it you mostly sent the guitar stuff, I think is really similar to Victor Villarreal's stuff. And I think it's really good guitar stuff on that Cadwallader album. And that led me down a little bit of an emo rabbit hole. Listen, I'm kind of looking for something that might have that same thing. And I didn't find anything. There's a lot of, stuff that when going into the math rock area that was kind of interesting to listen to musically. But yeah, vocally, I think there's something there that just really stands out.
So then what changes between, so Cap and Jazz is like this sort of very bright star that shines for a very short period of time. From what I know, them do a lot of touring. And then kind of implode at some point.
Yeah.
And they only really get the recognition afterwards when this anthology gets released. But during that time, Kinsella forms Joan of Arc. The first record, or the first two records that come out, because you described them as a pair or complementary set of records. What changes between Cap and Jazz and then these first two, Joan of Arc?
I mean, the obvious thing that stands out is that the guitar, they're slower. It's more like indie. There's no effects on the guitars. Everything's clean. And this is where they started to describe it as modernist. And we've had a discussion about modernism, but I think in this sense, the idea is that they've laid all the instruments next to each other, and every instrument is speaking its own clear truth about this song. The drums are playing a clear drum line, even though, the instruments are kind of like fitted together almost like a bit of a puzzle, but everything's clean, which is, totally different to the Cap and Jazz, and everything is orderly. But then again, you have Kinsella's voice, which is now not screaming so much, it's quiet, but it's still got that tone. It's still got that tone that cuts through. And actually now the lyrics are more decipherable, and it's actually, I realized how much I liked these lyrics. I was into, I guess, E. Cummins at the same time.
Right.
I don't like a lot of poetry, but something about E. Cummins' stuff and how he plays with the rules of language, and it's quite silly. And there was definitely something there that was similar in Kinsella's kind of lyrics. So yeah, it was a stark difference to hear those two albums more or less next to each other, the Cap and Jazz and the Portable Model and How Memory Works, the first two Joan of Arc LPs.
So the other difference is that I noticed when I was listening to this stuff, and obviously I missed the boss at the time, so I rather than the natural way, I guess, of listening to it as they come out, like you've done, is I've worked completely the opposite way and gone back with it. But it was, I didn't get the same kind of buzz from them that I did from the later albums that I got really excited about. But having listened to them a few times, there's still that same earnestness about his vocal style. There is, I recognise what you're saying about that. It's got that edge to it. That sort of, and Lennon's not a bad touch point actually for that. There is that sort of screamy thing that Lennon does that feels quite visceral and honest. That doesn't seem to be. It's not as disciplined as Lennon, I don't think. But it's certainly as sincere as he.
But the fact that we're kind of scratching around for influences is a big clue as to why we like them, because it's not easy to put your finger on where either Cap and Jazz or Joan of Arc were coming from in those days. And we talked a little bit, you mentioned Rites of Spring, which was kind of that, it's certainly not math rock, but it's certainly taking that emotional hardcore slightly more into indie and complex territory, and there are other kind of touch points at that time, but that was a burgeoning kind of scene of complexity in this kind of hardcore scene.
Yeah, I
And
cards on the table with regards to punk, because I've never been that into it, into punk with a capital P, as in the sort of the initial slow stuff that came out. When I first put that Rites of Spring record on, it was like, this is stuff that I don't really get much out of. But after a couple of minutes of the first track, I started to realise that there was something slightly different going on with the nature of the lyrics. With punk, I've always been more interested in the politics and the actual content that came out of the bands. And the DIY ethic and stuff like that is something that's always quite appealing. The music itself less so, and I've much more been interested in post-punk kind of bands.
Yeah.
Which I think is a more natural fit for everything that Kinsella did after Cap and Jazz. I think it's more that territory that he's mining, really. That Rites of Spring record, I can understand why it had the impact that it did, because I can't remember where I read this now, but it talked about that flip of punk lyrics no longer just being about external things and shouting at the world, and being much more introspective and being about kind of, how does this make me feel? I think that's quite an interesting change that happens with the album.
Yeah, and that change in that DC hardcore scene, going from Minor Threat into Fugazi, which, and it wasn't, obviously this kind of math rock branched off from there, and then you start to get this really technical kind of complex kind of stuff that does point back towards prog rock a little bit. But also what was happening around the scene in the jazz scene in Chicago, it's kind of like they were living in that place too. So they were punk kids, they were living in Chicago, but also that jazzy scene that then became, post rock, where Tortoise had one foot in that camp with Jeff Parker and all the like Chicago Underground Trio and all that stuff. It was a similar kind of era. I think just that mix of the punk rock, the indie rock, the emo, like second generation, second wave, and the math rock stuff. They're not any of those things, but they're all of those things in some measure. And then if you throw in something as discernible and as obvious as Villarreal's kind of guitar and the stuff that Kinsella and some of Sam Zurich and stuff played in the early albums, and that's just a really interesting and unique mix, which is why it's very hard to say here's another band that you want to listen. You like that Joan of Arc album, or you like that Cap and Jazz album, go listen to these guys. It's almost impossible to do that, because if you do that, they'll say, yeah, something's missing.
Well, it's like there's something about respecting the attitudes of what those different movements brought into music, I guess, and the fact that they've borrowed from those attitudes towards what you can do with music, rather than actually borrowing the music itself, which is what most bands do. So we've got this. So you've got Cap and Jazz, this interesting, different, emotionally heavy kind of punk music.
Yeah.
Joan of Arc, which is this much more stripped down, more cranial than emotional than the Cap and Jazz stuff, because of this idea, what you describe as modernist, but there's more thought going into how the whole thing is presented, rather than it just being this emotional kind of burst of stuff, which is what Cap and Jazz is to me. And then I'm going to skip over Live in Chicago and go straight to the Gap.
Let me stop you there, Phil.
Wrong.
It's called Live in Chicago. You know why?
Where's that?
Because all members of the band lived in Chicago in 1999.
Clever.
It's a play on words, Phil. He tricked you, even all these years later. He tricked you.
It still works.
But let's talk about the Gap.
So, the Gap. Well, how would you describe it in words of one syllable as an album? Because it comes out of a particular place where they were in a shift in technology, I guess. But the one thing that we haven't mentioned that was on those Joan of Arc albums that's different to Cap and Jazz is the electronica that kind of dropped.
Yeah. So the electronic stuff is kind of bubbling away in the background of that Joan of Arc, but it does interplay with the instruments pretty nicely on quite a few of the tracks. Gin and Platonic and some of the stuff off the first album. But then with the Gap, from my understanding, they decided to record it with Pro Tools, and they went a little bit mad and spent like a year or a year and a half overdubbing tiny little slivers of guitar over and over again. So each track has hundreds of little points that are almost collaged together. But for me, it holds together really well as a set of songs as well. But it's almost later in my notes here, I talked about his lyrics has been pointillist a little bit, you know, the kind of art style where everything's made up of little dots, right? And so if you zoom out, it makes sense, but when you go in, it's nonsense almost. But this is kind of the Gap thing. It's made up of all these tiny slivers, but it's not like a sound collage. They're actually songs that have been composed like methodically.
Yeah.
And I just listened back again, first time in a few years, and I thought the songs were really strong, and I thought that style of almost taping together hundreds of little slivers of guitar and noise and drums, it works really well.
Absolutely. When we started talking about doing this podcast, you sent me, was it an article? It was like an essay almost of the discography and kind of who was in the band at the time and sort of what they were up to. And when it talks about the Gap, it talks about how it was received first of all.
Yeah, it was not received well.
No, not at all. I read this before I listened to the album because I was still tracking my way through stuff. And so I went into the album thinking, oh, is this going to be like an hour's worth of noise that I'm just going to have to sit through to kind of get to the end? And I was shocked when I heard it because I got a real tingle listening to the songs on that album. So some of them quite amazing pieces of music have been put together. Things that it reminded me of are like really important albums. It reminded me of stuff like Pet Sounds or Trout Mask Replica or things like that, where there's so much thought gone into every section, every layer of how everything's put together. The idea of harmony being much more than just the musical notes that are being played, but how you construct these kind of almost like an architectural attitude towards an album. And I totally agree with you that some of the songs on it are absolutely amazing. The Cat Hers one.
The Black Pants Make Cat Hers appear. Yeah.
That instantly just jumped out at me as a track, and it was like, I think the ending of that song is just so haunting and really quite poetic. I think you're quite right about referencing E. Cummings as well. There's a really strong sense of poetry and poetics about his lyrics. It doesn't spoon feed you. It will give you clues as to what he's talking about, but he's expecting you to do some work with that as well. It's not like it's not just "I love you, baby, yeah." It's I'm going to give you clues as to what I'm trying to describe here, and I know we'll go back to that whole truth that modernist thing again and again through this, but to me, I think it's a really special album. I was really blown away when I heard it, and I think this is quite an interesting segue into how they've been received or how he's been received critically.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was absolutely panned. I mean, the thing is, if you read the Pitchfork reviews, the consistent line is that they hate him. They hate Kinsella's voice. They hate Kinsella's stuck-up, pretentious attitude. They hate his decisions about what he puts on the covers and what the titles of his songs are. They hate his lyrics that are non sequiturs. 1.8, I think, for the Gap is out of 10. And then consistently, these albums, like 3 and 4 out of 10. When like the Cadwallader album, which is good stuff, 7s and 8s.
Yeah.
And I think some of the Owl stuff scored quite high, and you were like, really? Is it that different?
Yeah.
Is it so markedly different that this is a 2 and this is an 8?
Well, I couldn't help escape feeling that there's a particular attitude in the way they go about reviewing Joan of Arc records in particular, which seems to be something along the lines of, you're not playing the game right, and because you're not playing the game right, we're going to punish you in some way. The only way that's at our disposal is to give you low numbers in this review and to complain about everything doing, and it really felt to me like quite sulky reviews of their stuff, and I don't know where that comes from. The only thing that I could put it down to was the fact that they either can't understand what he's doing or they refuse to understand what he's doing. And there's a famous Barthes thing where the French thinker, where he's talking about critics, where he said the most insulting thing that critics could do, or one of the ways that they try to insult artists, is by saying, well, it's obviously too clever for me. I don't. It's obviously too clever for me to understand it.
Exactly.
It's really harsh, backhanded kind of compliment, which is basically saying you're stupid and I'm not, but in this kind of Orwellian way. And I just
the Emperor's New Clothes. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of took that vibe from a lot of the reviews that are, especially on Pitchfork. There are other reviews are available, but obviously Pitchfork's really important because that's kind of the place to go for indie reviews. Isn't it?
Yeah, if you read the other reviews, generally they get fairly positive reviews. Pitchfork is pretty scathing, but a couple of things to remember at Pitchfork. One, it's based in Chicago.
Right.
So a lot of these guys might know him personally, which might mean either they actually are all in on it, and it is a big joke at our expense, and actually they all like Joan of Arc, or they just don't like him. They genuinely don't like this guy that hangs around the empty bottle where they go drinking, and it's like, that guy is a dick. I want to punish him with...
Well, the truth is probably somewhere in between the two, isn't it?
Possibly. Yeah, because I told you I saw him once, right? I went to the Empty Bottle in Chicago and I saw him sitting there, and I was too nervous to go over and talk to him, so I ended up talking to the guy out of the 90 Day Men instead.
Starstruck, man.
Starstruck.
I was going to say, oh yeah, so that just talking about the Pitchfork thing a little bit more, is it really reminded me of when the Pixies brought out that first album without Kim Deal on bass. And I think it's got like 1. It's like the lowest Pitchfork review ever. And I saw it with Frank Black afterwards, where he was quite obviously incensed at this review, but trying to play it as it being a wonderful thing that he'd had this.
Yeah. I got one over on that Condé Nast bunch of losers. But whatever the result of that, Joan of Arc did actually break up after the Gap, and that's when this is 2001, 2002, and I guess around that same time the 4 guys that originally were in Joan of Arc. I think Mike Kinsella was still in Joan of Arc at that point, maybe. So it was basically they brought Victor Villarreal back in. And then made that Owls album, which is phenomenal. It is a real highlight. You know, I'd say that Cap and Jazz and the first Joan of Arc album and the Owls album. If you're going to listen to anything from like 95 to 2005 of their stuff, those are the 3 albums. That Owls album, just awesome.
Yeah, because I remember when, after you'd sent me that Issues video and you were talking about Joan of Arc, and you said, oh, listen to this as well, and you sent me the Owls album through, I must have listened to that about 10 times through, and was just totally blown away by it. I just thought it was such really strong songs. All the normal criticisms that get levelled at Joan of Arc are just completely blown out of the water on that album, just because it shows that whilst his lyrics are never kind of simplistic and spoon-fed to you, the songs are really strong. They're coherent. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They do make for great pop songs, I would say, a lot of the time on that album. But just to talk about the guitar playing for a moment on it, it's absolutely phenomenal. Talking as a guitarist who's been playing for a long time, played live and recorded and stuff, I've spent so much time trying to work out what the hell he is doing on those guitar lines, and just been constantly impressed at how inventive they are.
Yeah, there's obviously the slurs and the kind of harmonics that they use a lot, but then I'm not really a guitarist, but I watched some of the videos of him playing those songs, and he's up and down the neck, like top, high string, low string, up and down, and you're just the combination of chords and notes is just, where's that come from? How have you made that path through those? That then is also not just some Derek Bailey atonal noise. It's a fantastic pop song, like, you know, What Horse You Rode In On.
Yeah. Well, Everyone Is My Friend is the one that I constantly keep going back to and just trying to get worked out. I've been lucky enough to have a little bit of correspondence with him where I've been checking sort of, is this the right guitar tuning that you're using? And had the opportunity to talk to him a bit about influences and stuff, which was quite surprising as well, because I'd bought into this kind of punk narrative, but a lot of his major influences are people who've been classically inspired, either classical guitarists or rock guitarists who've been inspired by that type of stuff. And when you get much more into that mindset, you start to realise just how musically literate he is. And the fact that you're quite right, he's the absolute opposite of that atonal kind of playing. He's got a really well-educated intuition around harmonic, how you build up harmonies and how you construct harmonic resolutions in the piece of music on a guitar, which is not always as apparent as it is on an instrument like the piano or a number of instruments to play that around with. And I think it's when you're seeing him dancing up and down the neck of the guitar, that's because what he's playing musically makes a lot of sense. But from a very physical point of view of how you get that out of a guitar, you have to be incredibly dexterous to be able to produce it.
But even if there's clearly something in their youth of when they were that formative coming up, because when you watch Tim Kinsella playing like acoustic sets or whatever, he's doing something very similar when he's kind of, like you're saying, it's like there's a melody coming through with the harmonies. It's almost like the melodies come first and then you've had to find a way to play that on the guitar. I'm sure that's not how they write it. It could be, but it's like, I want to make this kind of convoluted melody, which is also beautiful. Now, how do I play it on this machine? Oh, you have to play the 16th fret and then be down to the 3rd fret, and you need to tune it in this particular way. What I'd like to say here as well is something we've talked about a bit, is that although when you talk or when you read, there'll be names cited, like Tim Kinsella has cited Scott Walker and Lee Hazelwood as big influences. And Victor, when you spoke to him, talked about these classical kind of guitarists, but the unspoken kind of like water that they were drinking was this kind of punk, hardcore kind of stuff. So it's deeply seeped in this kind of punk hardcore kind of tradition. But then they brought in this kind of really unique influence to it, which has just added something to the mix that you don't get anywhere else.
Do you know what it reminds me of as well is Robbie Krieger and the Doors, because he's the only rock guitarist I'm familiar with where he brought in flamenco and classical ideas. I mean, the thing that most people know about him is the fact he's right-handed, just played with his fingers. And it's obvious on tracks like Spanish Caravan and stuff, but it was that it's not unique, but it was unique in that context, which I think is the point that you're making, is that within that warm water that they were all drinking of emotional hardcore, or however describing it, or punk, they were bringing in something that was of a much heavier weight musical heritage, a much kind of more informed pedigree of guitar playing, if you like, or an attitude towards how you get sound out of a guitar, rather than just thrashing 3 chords and the truth, or some of the less kind of controlled playing that was going on in the same kind of music.
Yeah.
So that's Owls. So that's big thumbs up for Owls.
Big thumbs up for Owls. And then he kind of did this little detour of Friend Enemy, which was a kind of rocky version of Joan of Arc, probably a little simpler, but still a lot of the same things going on. And then I guess they more or less reformed Joan of Arc. But the thing about Joan of Arc, it never really was a band. It was a collective, and I guess we'll talk about this at some point, or we could talk about it now if you like. The fact that the idea of Joan of Arc is, it's not the last gang in town. It's not the Clash. It's Tim Kinsella plus. At one point, he described it as whoever was having a shitty time, whoever just broken up with somebody and needed somewhere to stay and hang out. They were in the band until they got their shit back together, and then they left again. And it's kind of like, I've heard him describe it like that, almost like a therapy kind of session.
And it's like, so what year are we talking about now? This is sort of 2003 time.
So I still think at this point it's more of a relatively settled band lineup. Sam Zurich's in there, and I think his brother Mike's still around, and there's people kind of coming and going. And then they got to get back together for So Much Staying Alive and Lovelessness, and then at the same time they did this in Rape, Fantasy and Terror Sex We Trust. And then they went on with 2004, Joan of Arc, Dick Cheney, and Mark Twain, which was really quite poppy. There's stuff on there like Fleshy Jeffrey and stuff that's almost like sing-along and quite poppy. And they haven't necessarily lost that edge, but I think that's where I can see the Scott Walker kind of like pompous pop kind of bubbling through.
Hmm.
And there's a couple of Scott Walker covers around there at the same time. He does that Thanks for Chicago, Mr. James, I think is on there, and that's a Scott Walker cover. I see more of that influence, although you might not point it out if you weren't listening for it. But
it strikes me that you've got a couple of things going on in this 3-year period, or 3 or 4 years, between So Much Staying Alive and Lovelessness. Up to around sort of eventually All at Once, maybe, but up to that time period, you've got this extension of the form of the song. The songs seem to be getting more ambitious in terms of what they're demanding of the listener, and I think there's much more improvisation going on that's being recorded and woven into the records. And there's more noisescape type stuff seeming to appear in the records as well. So it's not just traditional kind of songs. It's much more around atmosphere and creating these moments within the record.
Especially the Terror Sex record, where he talks about the Bauhaus, not necessarily trying to recreate the sound of Bauhaus, but recreate the feeling that he felt of like being terrified or overwhelmed by this record when he heard this really intense kind of like screaming record. And then you get Terror Sex, which has got quite a few of those tracks on that are quite intense and dark, and they're not the kind of like jigsaw puzzle idea of everything fitting together beautifully. You're starting to get a little bit of improvisation and noise coming in there. And then alongside the Joan of Arc, which flips back to be quite poppy, but is more complex in its composition, definitely within the songs. And I think then something happens from about 2004. It starts to splinter a little bit, because you've got a live album, then he creates the Make Believe, which is a kind of more rocking version of what's happened in the Joan of Arc, but again very similar in its sound, just a little heavier. And then you have the Guitar Duets album, which is really interesting, and this is where this idea of Joan of Arc being maybe more of a collective. So essentially you've got like, I think 10 people who had played guitars so far on Joan of Arc records, or in that kind of area, and then they teamed up to do a bunch of like instrumental guitar pieces. Some of them are quite interesting. I don't think any of them are, because they're improvised, they sound very improvised. I don't think you've got any of that tightness that happened in those first couple of Joan of Arc and Owls albums. Cap'n Jazz was abrasive in the sense of it was punky, distorted guitars, but it wasn't actually kind of ear screeching, like noises and pitches. I don't think he does a lot of that through the catalog, but it's just another example of being okay with putting something in that's kind of like disturbing a little bit. And you kind of have to trust in that he's done it intentionally and thought it through, even if you think, oh, that doesn't quite work. Because there's a lot of experimentation. The thing with, if you look through the discography, especially at this point, you've got like guitar duets and then the make-believe albums, and then we come back with he does a soundtrack to a movie that they kind of put together. And so there's a lot of different stuff going on around this time, working with a lot of different people, and the only thing that's really holding it together is that a lot of it's released under the Joan of Arc kind of banner, but they're not really at that point pop albums. So around 2006, 2007 kind of era there.
Yeah, and I think it moves into another period at that point, doesn't it? It's and I'm thinking about sort of 2008 now and Boo Human, which I was quite surprised to hear that it was one of those. It's almost like, what do you call it, like a doodle album, where it was about who was available at the time to come in and record something, which I was really surprised about because it sounds so together. That as an album, it sounds like a tight band that's been touring. It's gone into the studio with some well-rehearsed material and knocks out a really solid kind of almost a rock album, really. I'd describe Boo Human as, but it wasn't that at all. It is much more this kind of collaboration with just Tim Kinsella at the centre of kind of overlapping groups of musicians that he's pulling in on.
Yeah. No, I think that's the one where it was like, we've got a week's worth of studio time or whatever, and we don't know who's available. So just sign yourself up for the slot when you can come in. And he kind of had an idea beforehand, and he would like play the track and say, okay, play along with this. I don't know if they'd heard it before. So I think the songs themselves were composed pretty well. Kinsella's part, his lyrics and his melodies, but then he would bring in these pretty crash hot musicians who would then play over the top of those kind of pieces. It does hold together pretty well. The songwriting on that album is pretty strong. Telltale Penis and so on.
Yeah, there's some great songs on that album. Really, really solid. I mean, personally, it's Insects Don't Eat Bananas. I think is just such a great little song, but lyrically so smart and clever and surprisingly traditional in its sort of subject matter.
Yeah.
The type of things that he writes about, and instantly accessible. Do you know what I mean? I think it's such a chirpy little tune for him to be singing along to. And I also think stuff like Pack or Unpack sounds like a cool record. It's got great noises going on in it that just draw you straight in. And I think his singing as well is really accessible on that album. It doesn't lose anything. It's not like when B-Furt tried to go poppy, lose anything for trying to do those, or even if it is trying to do those things. But there's certainly it's an accessible album. It's one of those albums that I would recommend to somebody to listen to first, much like you said about the Owls album. It's an easy one to get into.
Yeah, it does a lot of what the earliest stuff does, but it is more like an indie rock album, and I think. But then again, it's still got that stuff that appeals about all the other albums, like his lyrics and the guitar lines. And we're going to talk about lyrics in a little while, hopefully. But 9/11/2, he's like, I heard him talk in a podcast, and he was like, "What's the most, like, if you're going to talk about like being heartbroken, what's the most melodramatic and hyperbolic way to describe that? Well, what you did to me is like 9/11/2." But it's just so clunky and ridiculous. It doesn't work as any kind of romantic pop lyrics. So, I write songs, and I'm predominantly interested in lyrics a lot, and just stuff like that. It's
brilliant. I was listening to it in the car, the album, for the first time And I remember when that line, because he just screams that line at the start.
Yeah.
It's down 11 2, and I just burst out laughing.
Yeah.
But it's just such, like you say, it's clunky and it's funny, but that is, I think that's really it highlights the artist with the capital A attitude that he goes into this stuff with. It's like he is trying to find those, and it's. I know we're going to fall into this modernist, postmodernist bit at some point, but there is something about rejecting traditional approaches to describe the truth within modernism, isn't it? About finding new ways of trying to, as long as it's about defining truth and that the truth being something that is out there that you can actually get hold of. That's very much something that he's interested in.
Well, I think that's the one thing we can kind of agree on with this modernist, postmodernist, that in its the simplest definition, a modernist is someone who believes there is truth out there, and if you dig deep enough in inventive ways, you will find that truth. And I think that defines Kinsella in his earlier kind of stuff, but I think he starts to drift more, and that's probably coming into this period now that we talk about, like after about 2011, after they do like Boo Human and Flowers and Lifelike, which are all pretty standard indie rock Joan of Arc albums, and if you listen to those three back to back, if you like the style, that's not bad, but they're not as strong as a trio as some of the other stuff. But then about 4 years there, maybe less, 3 years, where he does these kind of like jam band things, like the Old Brother, where got like 30 or 40 people who have played in different combinations of Joan of Arc or whatever over the years and made little bands with him. Did this Lightbox Orchestra stuff, which was kind of an improvised set. Then they did the soundtrack to the silent movie of the Joan of Arc film from I think the 30s. And then he did this kind of like meditation on a pine cone. Conceptually, I really like one of the things about Kinsella's albums is everyone seems to have a different concept, even if they're pop albums. But these have really stark and obvious in-your-face concepts. Like, I'm going to meditate on a pine cone for like 10 hours, and then I'm going to try and play that in several different instruments. We're just going to do the soundtrack to a silent movie about Joan of Arc that our band's named after. And there's a period there, and that's kind of like, if you're going to say that the early stuff is modernist and it's about seeking the truth, there seems to be a point here where it's like, I might be reading too much into this, but these improvisations and these kind of like more open-ended pieces seem to suggest that maybe there isn't a truth out there. Maybe you have to explore all the possibilities, and it's all relative.
Well, I was watching an interview with him where he talks about, he defines modernism in terms of curating things, which I was a little bit surprised at, because to me, that attitude towards any form of art, but music as well, is quite postmodernist. It's almost like this eclectic, well, I like that and I like that and I like this, and I'm going to put that together and see what that produces. And I don't see that as falling under the same camp as I know there's a truth out there, and I'm going to use these things to define to describe what that truth is. It was much more of a kind of chaotic collaging of things and just see what comes out of it. And
I think in this period there's very much that, but I think I would buy it in the early period where it's like, let's go back to that first Joan of Arc album. It's very clear guitar lines alongside really clear drums, bass, and vocals, and everything is clear but still abstracted. It's not predictably clear, but every single element is clear in its own way. And when you put it together, you get closer to the truth Whereas if you're doing an improvisation or just mixing everything up, that kind of curatorship, yeah, that's almost like saying I can put these together in different ways. And every time I put these people together, they're going to come up with something different. But whether or not he says every time I put them together, they're going to come up with a different form of the truth. Yes, you'd have to pick his brains a little bit more, but I would give him the benefit of the doubt, at least that he's thought it through, because he seems to be a fairly considered fella when you listen to him talk and read the stuff he's written. He knows what he's talking about with a lot of the literature and musical history and things like that.
Well, when we've talked about Victor Villarreal's guitar playing and how well informed that is musically, the fact that it's incredibly literate, one of the things that you get from listening to Tim Kinsella is the fact that he, like you say, he does know his stuff. It's not like he's floundering around in the artistic kind of toolbox. He's got very strong conceits for what he's going into a project with. He knows what the heritage is that he's pulling on, both for his lyrics and his music, and more generally kind of wider culture and the artistic influences that he drags into these things. So I would never do him the disservice of thinking that he's just kind of throwing random shit together. But I have a curiosity as to where he sits on that whole kind of modernist, postmodernist thing, because well, it's the debate of the moment, isn't it? But it's also about what your intentions are as an artist as well. So I think there's something quite important there about what the point of it all is.
Yeah, and he describes a wakefulness, and I think you can see that trying to come through of this idea of like being awake to what's going on around you and almost holding a mirror up to what's happening. And again, I heard him talk about how he used to write his lyrics, and he would essentially open up the dictionary, choose one word, open up, choose another word, but then it was the connection between those two words that would then form the meaning. So, and the idea that everything that was happening around him, if he was wide awake and just trying to just let it come out, it was almost going to inevitably mirror the culture around him. So again, almost like going back to Mark Smith and how some of his lyrics are seen as prophetic, but really all he's doing is looking at the newspaper, watching the television, having his brain switched on and just picking out little bits here and there, and then composing those together. And then lo and behold, they seem to be speaking of the future or of now, because they're almost just little bits of the mirror all stuck together. Let's motor on through, because I think after you get this period of these kind of like improvisational pieces, then he kind of gets back on the song wagon around 2013. He does that album with Angel Olsen, the songs of Marvin Tate. And that stuff's awesome. It's really quite different. You know, it reminds me of Daniel Johnson, the Moldy Peaches, that kind of very naive kind of pop, Sesame Street-esque.
It inspired me to go back to listen to that album, Songs in the Key of Z. To really that outside of music stuff, which obviously Daniel Johnson and Wesley Willis are both on it, but there's some lesser known artists on there. It's a lot of fun to listen to. There's certain tracks on there that I've played to other people, just as in listen to this, it's a scream. But there's some a bit. So I'm not as familiar with that Marvin Tate album as I have been with Marvin Tate himself, because I started to listen to that album and then I thought, well, I don't know what I'm comparing these to, because everyone keeps talking about how these vocals have surprised people on that album. So I went back to listen to Marvin Tate. I just got lost in Marvin Tate stuff because it's great.
It is good stuff, and I hadn't heard him before.
Yeah. The standout track for me, the first one that I listen to, it's always the first one you listen to, isn't it? It's if it really grabs you, but it's the Take Off Your Shoes and Run, which is on the last album that he did, but there's an earlier version which is on a collection, which I think is much better, where it's got this bizarre arrangement of just these kind of spasmodic drums and an accordion and a piano, just kind of banging out these occasional these rhythms every other bar, and with him kind of growling these lyrics in between about a woman who wants bigger tits. And I was just sucked straight into it. So unfortunately, I've not listened to much of the Kinsella album, but I do really like the Marvin Tate stuff.
When I listened to Marvin Tate, and I expected something more akin to Wesley Willis, and Wesley Willis, Chicago also, but Wesley Willis had this much more ranting kind of wild style. But Marvin Tate's stuff was actually, it was pretty bluesy in a kind of well-delivered kind of like blues voice. He has a strong voice, but the arrangements are really kind of wonky, and then this kind of like the phrasing and the lyrics, and yeah, it's wild, it's out there. But what Kinsella did essentially is kind of made them almost into nursery rhymes, which is unusual for Kinsella as well. It's like I say, it sounds a lot more like Daniel Johnson than Joan of Arc, but I really like it. It's a bit of an anomaly in his catalogue, though, because then I think Owls got back together and did a second album, which is really strong. I don't think it's as strong as the first one, but I think musically it is just as strong. I just don't think the songs jump out quite as much as the ones on the first album. And then I guess, well, this is when they start to have this kind of little bit of a renaissance, which is where I guess you got back into them with basically those two albums of he's got the whole This Land Is Your Land in his hands, and the one that just came out last year, 1984. So maybe you can talk about your passion.
Yeah. So, well, this was my in, basically. After you'd sent me the link to Issues and the Owls stuff, and I think bizarrely the first thing I actually listened to was Testimonium songs. That was just enjoyed it, just enjoyed the experience, and I thought, all right, well,
it's not a bad album, yeah.
And but it didn't jump out to me. I just thought it was pretty cool, and it was worth exploring more. And then I listened to he's got the whole This Is Your Land in his hands, and just fell in love with every single song on that album. I thought it was absolutely brilliant, and more than anything else, because I know you've said before now the electronics is the weakest part of his game. It was less that interested, although I do think there's some interesting stuff on there, and I think they've had another hard ride with that album in terms of critical response. But I love the lyrics. I love the lyrics on that album. I just think it's everything that's the best about what he does, which is he definitely kind of picks his way through what at face value are quite just funny lyrics. Pizza and Cunnilingus both give me heartburn type stuff, which is kind of kind of stuff, to these really kind of raw lyrics about when you don't expect them as well, which it's almost like that Smiths thing of juxtaposing where the music's at and what he's actually singing about when he talks about putting his dad's sweater on and stuff. Really quite heartbreaking at times, so the actual subject matter of what he's talking about.
But then he'll hit you with I know how the nicest guy in ISIS feels. It doesn't let you linger in that pain for too long.
That's so bizarre, because that's such a strange lyric, and I found myself singing that for weeks after that album. You know, when the tune just put, like, you get an earworm. I found myself wandering around singing "I Know How the Nicest Guy in ISIS Feels," which is great. But I really love that album, and I think there's some really clever lyrics on that. Because the one thing that I was going to ask you about, really, on your take on that, is how much of that album is Tim Kinsella and how much of it is the woman whose name escapes me now. Is her involvement, because in that noisy documentary, which is quite, I didn't really get a lot out of it. I enjoyed watching it, but I didn't get a lot of information out of it about how they do it.
It was pretty light, actually. Yeah, it's kind of just following him around.
But the woman who's a permanent member of the band now talks about helping out with the lyrics, and I couldn't quite understand whether she meant as a backing vocalist or as a vocalist in the band, or how much influence she has, because I suspect as a collaboration it's not going to work unless people get a say.
I think her name is pronounced Ausikaitis. Melina Ausikaitis, but maybe we'll just call her Melina for now, because I think massacring her last name there. But yeah, she came onto the scene, and then they did the video was this must be the placenta, and just musically, there's definitely a change there. It's not got any of that tightness anymore. There's not even predominantly guitars, and it's kind of much more of a meld of the electronics and the keys, keyboards, and some guitars in there. But I still think the Kinsella lyrics and the vocals kind of carry it there. I don't know how much she had to do with the actual writing of the lyrics.
Where we were up to then, where you were talking about Melina, I think is just a nice segue into 1984 as an album where she takes the vocal duties for the whole album.
Yeah, so I think that's the big change there, right? So at some point they decided, I don't know how long it's going to last, but Melina takes over singing all of the songs on 1984, and it actually works really well. It's that old kind of like, if you replace every single part of the car, is it still the same car? Because now there's nothing there other than Kinsella's kind of lyrics and probably his melodies, but his voice isn't there anymore. There's none of those clear guitar lines anymore. There's a lot of electronics on there.
There's a lot of atmosphere on that album, isn't there? It's
yeah.
And I thought there's a very strong sense of, when you were talking about the Marvin Tate thing, there's like these nursery rhyme kind of melodies going on. Tiny Baby, especially, that's something my 2-year-old sings. That opening line of Tiny Baby, she absolutely loves that. But everything else is a really strong narrative sense to it, where it feels quite biographical. I'm not sure how honest it is, and I'm tempted to quote that. I'm sure it wasn't Alan Moore who came up with it, but the whole telling a lie to tell the truth thing, it feels very sincere.
Yeah, and I think he's playing around, and maybe if we get to that idea of sincerity now, I think he circles around truthfulness and then kind of plays with a little bit of metaphor and plays with some things that are clearly not true, but in doing that, he's kind of like circling around the truth, circling around what really happened. And eventually, if he comes back to it enough times that you can be like, oh, okay, I can see that part of it is true. So maybe say Punk Kid, for example, maybe there's not, maybe some of the little vignettes in that story didn't necessarily happen, but they're close enough to what did happen, and the feeling at the time that they're still true.
I think Punk Kid's a really, I love that tune, and we've talked a lot about the musicality with it, but the thing that really I like about that is it's not my childhood, but I can recognize some of the emotions that he's talking about in the poetry of the lines. There's a line in it where she sings about I run to the woods, I run the woods. And I think that's a really nice play on what that can mean, that line about, those sort of childish fantasies that you have when you're in a particular space and you think, this is my space and I'm going to run it how I want to run it. Or
Yeah.
even it's just that kind of wild abandon of running around an open space and stuff. There's a real, I mean, I think the title of the album's a clue, isn't it? But there's a real childhood memories thing going on with that whole album.
Yeah, and the covers obviously drawings of them as children, but I think there's that innocence, and maybe that's why he chose Milena as the singer on that rather than himself, because he doesn't have that innocence in his voice per se. He has that kind of aggressiveness, so that kind of like obtuseness, and she almost has a country singer kind of vibe to it, and brings that kind of, without losing the honesty, but also adds a kind of like sweetness to the mix in terms of vocals. And you know, you get people like Lee Hazelwood, or even someone like Paul Heaton from the Beautiful South and the House Martins, that would write for female voices because not just because they were female, but because they brought something else to the mix in terms of the sound, in terms of the phrasing. The E. Cummins idea, you know, so he titled his first EP, he sang his didn't, he danced his did, which I thought was a great line, and then I later realized it was E. Cummins. And I think although I'm not necessarily saying that, I've never seen anywhere that says he's trying to ape Cummins' work, but there's definitely a lot of that same kind of romanticism, oblique romanticism in there. So straightforward one that I like is Cotton Brown Octobers. This August it's wool. We know we can't quite kiss yet. Let's wrestle. That kind of like, and then this kind of like idea of almost the Zen, living in a wakefulness of, I know what I have to do and do it, but I don't know what it is until it's done. This kind of, he's living the life, and it's almost like how he works. So I got to make this music, I've got to design it, I've got to live it, and it's only when it's finished that I know what it will be.
Yeah, which I think there's a real truth there, isn't there? I know one of our mutual friends who's a psychologist, I remember him saying to me about, I don't know what I think until I've said it.
Yeah.
You have to go through a process of actually articulating something sometimes before you know how you feel about it. I really love the end of as Black Pants Make Cat Hers Appear, where it goes into that sort of chanty chorus of, and he quips in one of the interviews that I saw about them not having these big kind of rousing choruses in the music, but that it's these uneven, unquiet, or even unsaid connections must mean something. And I've always been quite obsessed with the idea of significance and how we identify what is significant and what isn't significant. And to me, it just touches on that feeling of there's got to be some kind, and to me, it's a very modernist idea.
Yeah, I think so.
There's got to be some point to this.
I think the modernism comes through strongest in his lyrics. There's this kind of, it's oblique, but there's truth in there. It's not relative. If you look at this hard enough, it's not a non sequitur, and there is truth in here, and I'm trying to be ridiculous or dance around it to get to this kind of like, you know, vague or vaporous kind of truth.
Well, I find it interesting that criticism of his lyrics about them being non sequiturs is similar to the criticism that Beckett had about his dialogue, and I think they are fellow travellers in trying to use some of those techniques to get to something that is real.
Yeah, and mixing the mundane and the kind of rude and brutish alongside this kind of Zen almost kind of openness, and then mixing in the kind of like romanticism of Cummins or Eliot with a wasteland, kind of like that kind of idea.
Last thing to say then is, what's your favourite Joan of Arc song or your favourite Tim Kinsella song?
I think it's really hard to kind of say, and I always forget the titles. But I listened to the album that he did of the Firecrackers, which was did a couple of years ago, and I think he's covered a lot of his favorite songs, and I think that's a good place to start. So like Gin and Platonic or the Black Cats, or but I think if I had to just pick one, I think it is the Who's Horse off the first track off that first Owls album. It just lyrically, delivery, and musically it just pops in every way, and it's super cool.
Yeah.
How about you?
Well, I'm struggling. It's either going to be Issues, just because it's that first hit thing, and that's always the sweetest one.
Yeah.
Or Punk Kid, maybe, just because I just, right from the first moment I heard it, it really resonated with my own childhood memories. And I think there's the one thing that we haven't talked about, which I would have liked to get your opinion on, is kind of where class comes into this as well, because I do get the impression from him that he's from very much a working class family environment, and I think carries through into a lot of his lyrics and some of his ambitions. But maybe we'll get to talk about that another time then. Yeah,
I hope so. But I put together a playlist on YouTube, so we can link that into wherever this goes.
Yeah.
And cheers for that. I enjoyed the talk, and hopefully we can do it again.
We will do, man. Okay. From Chimp 1 to Chimp 2. Peace out.
Peace out.
That was the VALIS Podcast. That was the VALIS Podcast.